This is my news of today by Rayme Jurmain Djalis from the Netherlands. This is Black African Diaspora News on December 4, 2025. Starting with Black YouTuber news. Tariq Nasheed cheerleading for Trump after he snapped on Somalis. A critical analysis. Based on Neferkare T. Dessalines YouTube video reaction. Introduction. The political landscape in the United States has always been shaped by immigration narratives, race, and the dynamics between media commentary and public perception. The YouTube video Tariq Nasheed cheerleading for Trump after he snapped on Somalis reaction by Neferkare T. Dessalines explores this intersection, focusing on former President Donald Trump's controversial remarks regarding Somali immigrants and Tariq Nasheed's subsequent reaction. Trump's statements, which targeted Somali immigrants in Minnesota, emphasized claims of welfare dependency, fraud, and social destruction. Neferkare T. Dessalines analysis frames Tariq Nasheed's response as a form of political cheerleading, positioning him as a hype man for Trump despite his long-standing role as a commentator on Black grassroots issues. This report critically examines the key points raised in Dessalines' video, situating them within broader discussions on U.S. immigration policy, racial narratives, and media influence. Trump's immigration rhetoric and strategy. Donald Trump's rhetoric on Somali immigrants fits within a broader strategy of selective targeting. As Dessalines points out, Trump focused on Somali Americans despite their relatively low immigration numbers compared to larger immigrant groups such as Mexicans, Indians, and Chinese. The Minnesota Somali community, long established yet numerically minor in the broader context of U.S. immigration, became a symbolic target for political messaging. Trump framed his criticism around claims that Somali immigrants were committing welfare fraud and exploiting public resources. He portrayed Minnesota as being ripped off by Somali residents, echoing his broader pattern of highlighting the alleged failures of specific immigrant groups, while ignoring the larger systemic issues caused by other demographics. For example, Dessalines contrasts Trump's targeting of Somali immigrants with his commutation of David Gentile, a white-collar criminal convicted of defrauding investors of over $1.6 billion. This discrepancy underscores a selective enforcement of moral outrage, a pattern frequently observed in political discourse surrounding minority communities. Furthermore, Trump's remarks can be understood as political pandering, designed to galvanize his base. Dessalines emphasizes that Trump's attacks were less about actual immigration issues and more about reviving support among conservative voters frustrated by his handling of prior controversies, including the Epstein files and meetings with former jihadist figures. Tariq Nasheed as political commentator. Tariq Nasheed has established himself as a prominent commentator on issues affecting the African diaspora, often addressing systemic racism, social justice, and Black empowerment. In the context of Trump's remarks on Somali immigrants, Dessalines critiques Nasheed for aligning with Trump's narrative, portraying him as acting in the capacity of a cheerleader or hype man. Dessalines argues that Nasheed's reaction, supporting or rationalizing Trump's statements, undermines his credibility within the Black community. Rather than challenging discriminatory rhetoric, Nasheed is framed as amplifying it, which Dessalines suggests is emblematic of misaligned priorities among certain commentators who emphasize selective victimization over systemic analysis. This critique raises important questions about the role of commentators in shaping public perception. Is the goal to educate and protect the community, or to engage in emotional spectacle that inadvertently supports the agendas of political actors? Somali immigrant communities in the U.S. Somali immigrants in the United States, particularly in Minnesota, represent a distinct community shaped by migration, conflict, and resilience. Minnesota hosts the largest Somali diaspora in the U.S., with members contributing culturally, socially, and economically. Many Somali immigrants arrived as refugees fleeing civil war and instability in Somalia, seeking safety and opportunities to rebuild their lives. Dessalines highlights that Trump's rhetoric misrepresents the Somali community by exaggerating claims of fraud and welfare dependency. While some individuals may engage in misconduct, as in any community, these incidents are not representative of the entire population. In fact, Somali Americans have been active in business, education, and civic engagement. The oversimplification of Somali immigrants as a monolithic problem group reflects long-standing patterns of scapegoating minority communities in American politics. Comparative analysis. Other immigrant groups. Dessalines video draws attention to disparities in accountability and media coverage between different immigrant groups. The commutation of David Gentile, a white former private equity executive convicted of defrauding investors, highlights selective outrage. Gentile's release contrasts sharply with the scrutiny directed at Somali immigrants, reinforcing the argument that systemic bias influences which groups are publicly condemned. Additionally, Dessalines notes that the largest immigrant groups in the U.S., including Mexicans, Indians, Chinese, and Central Americans, are largely ignored in Trump's critique, further illustrating selective targeting. By focusing on small or marginalized groups, politicians can create the perception of action while leaving larger structural inequities unaddressed. This punching down strategy maintains political narratives of control while avoiding the complexities of broader immigration policy. Historical and socio-political context. The Somali immigrant situation can be better understood through historical and socio-political lenses. Black immigrant populations in the U.S. often face dual challenges: racialization within American society and cultural differences within the African diaspora. Dessalines points out that Tariq Nasheed emphasizes Somali immigrants' alleged critiques of African Americans, framing them as a threat to the Black community. However, this perspective neglects the nuanced reality of Somali immigrants' experiences, including structural barriers, cultural integration, and economic challenges. Moreover, Dessalines situates the targeting of Somali immigrants within a historical pattern of racial scapegoating. Minority populations, particularly Black and immigrant communities, have historically been portrayed as threats to social stability or economic resources. This pattern reinforces systemic inequalities while deflecting attention from dominant groups' accountability, as evidenced by the disproportionate leniency afforded to white-collar criminals. Media narratives and public perception. Neferkare T. Dessalines analysis emphasizes the role of media, social commentary, and online platforms in shaping narratives around race and immigration. The video illustrates how commentators like Tariq Nasheed can amplify political messaging, whether intentionally or inadvertently. By reacting to Trump's statements without challenging their validity, commentators may reinforce harmful stereotypes or contribute to misinformed public perception. Dessalines also critiques the emotional framing of Nasheed's commentary. The use of rhetoric, metaphor, and dramatic comparisons, such as likening Nasheed to a hype man on stage, highlights the performative aspects of commentary that prioritize spectacle over analysis. This dynamic can obscure factual understanding and reinforce selective narratives that serve political agendas rather than the interests of targeted communities. Selective targeting and political strategy. A core theme in Dessalines' video is the strategic targeting of vulnerable populations for political gain. By focusing on Somali immigrants, a group with limited numbers and perceived social visibility, Trump's administration could signal action to supporters without addressing broader issues of immigration or inequality. Dessalines emphasizes that this tactic is consistent with the historical pattern of political pandering, creating crises or enemies to unify a base while avoiding substantive reform. Additionally, the video critiques the portrayal of Somali immigrants as fraudulent or undeserving. Dessalines contrasts this with high-profile cases of white-collar crime, demonstrating the inequity in public accountability. This disparity underscores the racialized nature of political targeting and highlights the importance of critically analyzing media narratives to identify underlying motives. Cultural and sociological dimensions. Dessalines' analysis also explores the cultural and sociological dimensions of Somali immigrants' experiences. He notes that anti-Black sentiments within the Somali diaspora are often exaggerated by commentators like Tariq Nasheed to create a narrative of division. While some Somali individuals may hold prejudices, particularly against African Americans, this is not universally true. The focus on conflict between Black immigrant populations and African Americans diverts attention from systemic inequities and reinforces internal divisions within the African diaspora. Moreover, Dessalines situates these dynamics within a global context, referencing similar patterns in Sudan, the Horn of Africa, and the Caribbean. These patterns suggest that anti-Black sentiments can emerge in mixed societies where power imbalances, historical trauma, and economic competition intersect. Understanding these complexities is essential to moving beyond simplistic narratives of blame or victimhood. Analysis of media influence and commentary. The video highlights the interplay between social media influencers, political figures, and public perception. Dessalines critiques Nasheed's focus on Somali immigrants, arguing that it aligns with Trump's agenda rather than serving the Black community's interests. By amplifying political messaging without challenging its factual basis, commentators risk normalizing selective outrage and reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Dessalines' metaphor of Nasheed as a backup dancer or hype man effectively illustrates the performative nature of commentary in the digital age. This framing underscores how public figures can become instruments of political theater, shaping discourse through emotion and spectacle rather than critical analysis. Broader implications. The issues raised in the video have several broader implications. Political exploitation of minority groups. The targeting of Somali immigrants exemplifies how politicians use small, visible populations to signal action without addressing larger systemic challenges. Media responsibility. Social media commentators play a crucial role in shaping public understanding. Amplifying selective narratives without critique can reinforce misinformation and perpetuate division. Racial and cultural dynamics. Misrepresentation of immigrant communities, particularly Black immigrants, can exacerbate social tensions and reinforce harmful stereotypes. Selective accountability. Disparities in public scrutiny and legal consequences for different demographic groups highlight structural inequities that persist across social, economic, and political domains. Conclusion. The YouTube video Tariq Nasheed cheerleading for Trump after he snapped on Somalis' reaction provides a critical lens through which to analyze the intersection of immigration, race, and political rhetoric. Neferkare T. Dessalines highlights several key themes. The selective targeting of Somali immigrants by Trump, the amplification of political messaging by commentators like Tariq Nasheed, and the broader implications of media influence on public perception. By contextualizing these events within historical, socio-political, and cultural frameworks, the analysis reveals the strategic use of rhetoric to galvanize political support and the consequences for marginalized communities. Dessalines' critique emphasizes the need for critical engagement with media narratives and calls attention to disparities in accountability, representation, and public discourse. Ultimately, the report underscores a central tension in contemporary American politics: the intersection of race, immigration, and media influence, and how these forces shape perceptions, policies, and the lived experiences of immigrant communities. The case of Somali immigrants in Minnesota exemplifies broader patterns of scapegoating, selective enforcement, and political spectacle, highlighting the importance of nuanced analysis and informed engagement in public discourse. My next news is critical analysis. Phillip Scott questions why Ilhan Omar and the Somalis in America are calling themselves Black, a response to Javin Bernardes' commentary on YouTube. Introduction. On YouTube, content creator Javin Bernardes published a video titled, Phillip Scott questions why Ilhan Omar and the Somalis in America are calling themselves Black. In this video, Bernardes reacts to Phillip Scott's commentary, which scrutinizes Representative Ilhan Omar's self-identification as Black, and questions the racial classification of Somali immigrants in the United States. Scott's argument, as summarized by Bernardes, suggests that Somalis, being ethnically Somali and not African American, cannot legitimately claim Black identity in the American socio-political landscape. This report provides a critical analysis of Scott's claims, examining their historical, sociological, and political underpinnings while integrating the specific points raised in the video commentary. It highlights the confusion between race and ethnicity that permeates Scott's critique and situates the discussion within the broader dynamics of Black identity, African immigrant integration, and American racial politics. The analysis focuses on the distinction between race and ethnicity in theory and practice, the historical development of Black identity in the United States, the role of Somali immigrants and Ilhan Omar within the Black racial category, critical evaluation of Scott's claims using historical evidence, social science theory, and contemporary political reality. the broader implications of conflating race and ethnicity in public discourse. Understanding the video context. Bernardus frames Scott's video as a critique of Omar's use of the term black immigrants. When addressing Somali-American communities in the U.S., Scott repeatedly questions, when did Il and Omar become black? And suggests that African immigrants are ethnically distinct from African Americans, implying that racial identities should be tied exclusively to historical lineage within the U.S. This framing has sparked controversy, as it reflects both an overly narrow view of black identity and a misunderstanding of race in the American context. In the video, Bernardus emphasizes several key points from Scott. Blackness is being treated as a racial category only, separate from ethnic identity. The use of black immigrant community is, according to Scott, misleading and potentially divisive. Scott criticizes Omar for virtue signaling, implying she artificially merges Somali immigrants with black Americans for political purposes. He maintains that black Americans have a distinct ethnic identity, from which African immigrants are ostensibly excluded. Bernardus counters these claims by clarifying that blackness in the U.S. is racial, not ethnically exclusive, and that Somali immigrants, while ethnically Somali, are still racially black, especially in the context of American society. Conceptual analysis. Race versus ethnicity. Race as a social construct. Scott's central argument rests on a flawed premise, that blackness is synonymous with a particular ethnic heritage within the U.S. In sociological terms, however, race is a social construct rooted in physical characteristics such as skin color and shared ancestry. This classification has historically been applied broadly to people of African descent, regardless of their specific cultural or national origins. Key observations from Bernardus's commentary. Scott's video suggests black identity is conditional upon African American lineage, which ignores the historical inclusivity of the racial category black. Bernardus notes that the term black originated as a racial designation in the U.S., popularized by figures such as Rayme T, and has historically encompassed all people of African descent. In other words, Somalis, Jamaicans, Nigerians, and other African-descended individuals are all racially black in America, even if they retain distinct ethnic identities. Ethnicity and cultural identity. Ethnicity emphasizes shared cultural traits, language, religion, and ancestry. Scott conflates ethnicity with race, implying that black Americans have a singular ethnic identity that excludes African immigrants. Bernardus critiques this view, highlighting that ethnicity is distinct from racial classification, and that black racial identity is inclusive of multiple ethnicities. Table 1. Race and ethnicity in the American context. Category: African Americans, Somali immigrants. Race: black, black. Ethnicity: African American, Somali. Culture: U.S.-based historical experience, Somali language, religion, traditions. Bernardus points out that Scott's insistence on an ethnic prerequisite for blackness misrepresents the historical and contemporary understanding of race in the U.S. Historical context of black identity in America. The legacy of slavery. The categorization of people as black in America originates from the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were grouped into a single racial category, despite their diverse ethnic origins. The use of broad terms like Negro or colored was intended to distinguish enslaved Africans from Europeans, rather than to acknowledge the nuanced ethnic differences among Africans. Bernardus emphasizes that Scott ignores this historical fact, instead arguing that black Americans possess a separate ethnic identity. In reality, the shared experience of racialization, discrimination, and systemic exclusion has historically unified all African-descended individuals under the black racial category. The one-drop rule. Historically, the United States applied the one-drop rule, which classified anyone with any African ancestry as black. This principle underscores the inclusivity of racial identity, rather than its exclusivity based on ethnicity. Somali immigrants, even if ethnically distinct, fit within this racial classification due to their African ancestry. Somali immigrants and the American racial landscape. Migration and naturalization. Bernardus highlights Scott's discussion of Somali immigration, noting the following. Large-scale Somali migration occurred during the Somali Civil War, 1990s onwards, under refugee and TPS programs. Many Somalis became naturalized citizens, while others had US-born children, reinforcing their legal and social integration. Despite their ethnic specificity, Somali immigrants experience racial discrimination and therefore share common struggles with African Americans. Political representation. Ilhan Omar represents Somali-American constituents and is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, demonstrating that American political institutions recognize Somali immigrants as part of the Black racial category. Bernardes critiqued Scott's framing, noting that questioning Omar's Blackness undermines both racial solidarity and political representation. Analysis of key claims in Scott's commentary. Claim 1. Somalis cannot be Black in America. Scott repeatedly asks, when did Ilhan Omar become Black? Implying that Somali immigrants are racially distinct. Bernardes refutes this by emphasizing, Blackness in America is defined by shared African ancestry and racialization, not by ethnicity or cultural history. Somali immigrants face systemic racism similar to African Americans, validating their inclusion in the racial category. Claim 2. Black Americans have a unique ethnic identity. Scott argues that African immigrants cannot be considered part of the Black community due to the existence of a singular Black American ethnic identity. Bernardes highlights the historical inaccuracy of this claim, pointing out that Black American identity has always been primarily racial, inclusive of individuals with African ancestry. Historical figures like Barack Obama and modern African immigrants demonstrate the racial inclusivity of Black identity in practice. Claim 3. Use of Black immigrant separates communities. Scott criticizes Omar's use of the term Black immigrant as disaggregating Somalis from African Americans. Bernardes clarifies, the term accurately acknowledges both racial identity and immigrant status. It does not negate racial solidarity, but highlights the specific socio-cultural challenges faced by African immigrants. Sociological implications. Misunderstanding race and ethnicity. Scott's video illustrates a broader social issue, the conflation of race and ethnicity. This misunderstanding can lead to marginalization of immigrant communities within racial discourse, unnecessary interracial conflict based on cultural or national origin, confusion over political representation and solidarity. Solidarity across the African diaspora. Bernardes emphasizes that the African diaspora in the U.S. encompasses multiple ethnicities, united by racial identity. Somali immigrants, African Americans, and other African-descended communities share both experiences of racialization and political interests, supporting Omar's framing of Black immigrant communities. Conclusion. Phillip Scott's commentary, as summarized by Javan Bernardes, demonstrates a misunderstanding of race, ethnicity, and Black identity in the United States. Key points include, Blackness in America is a racial identity, not a narrowly defined ethnic one. Somali immigrants, while ethnically distinct, are fully Black within the U.S. racial framework. Terms like Black immigrants accurately reflect both racial and immigrant identity without undermining solidarity. Misrepresenting Black identity as ethnically exclusive risks division and miseducation. Bernardes' analysis provides clarity and context, demonstrating that Ilhan Omar's identification as Black and her political representation of Somali immigrants is historically, socially, and politically legitimate. Black identity in the U.S. has always been inclusive, multifaceted, and grounded in shared experiences of racialization, making Scott's objections both factually and conceptually flawed. My next news is Source: Africa News. Toxic smoke chokes Conakry community as residents plead for government action. Conakry. In the densely populated Dar es Salaam neighborhood of Conakry, life has become a daily struggle for breath. Residents living near the city's towering municipal trash dump have endured years of thick, toxic smoke from the constant burning of waste, a crisis that shows no signs of abating. For many, the fumes have transformed daily existence into a fight for survival, as families contend with coughing, sleepless nights, and chronic health problems caused by the acrid smoke that blankets the community. For Dauda Silla, a father of 3, the damage is already deeply felt. I live in a very distressing condition, he told Africa News in Susu, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Simply sitting affects my lungs as if a fire was burning inside. Even more so when I take a walk of 20 to 30 meters. It becomes a real problem. Silla describes nights spent tossing and turning, coughing until the early hours, with only cold water providing temporary relief. When he visits local clinics, doctors offer conventional advice. Quit smoking and reduce alcohol consumption. But I don't smoke cigarettes and I don't drink either, he said with frustration. The problem is not in my habits. It's in the air I breathe every day. Like Silla, many residents blame the expanding municipal dump, whose fires send plumes of smoke over homes, schools, and businesses. The site has grown dramatically in recent years, with mountains of waste now dominating the horizon and contributing to an environment residents describe as unlivable. The smoke is heavy with particulates and toxins, creating conditions that local health experts warn are hazardous to both short and long-term health. Children at greatest risk. Among the most vulnerable are children, whose developing lungs are particularly susceptible to pollution. Mamadama Bangora, a mother in Dar es Salaam, says her young son Jibril has suffered chronic illness since infancy. This child is often disturbed by the smoke coming from the dump. That's what exhausts him, she explained. Every time he goes outside and breathes in the air, he first suffocates and then has a crisis that lasts 2 days. When that happens, we are forced to give him oxygen. He doesn't even go outside anymore. Local health professionals confirm that the situation poses a significant public health threat. Pulmonologist Nyan Balamang Gobutakba, who works at a clinic near Dar es Salaam, warned that the community is at risk of developing severe respiratory illnesses. In the long term, the local population may develop bronchopulmonary cancer, he said. This pollution is slowly killing the nearby population. We are seeing an increase in pneumonia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and other serious respiratory conditions directly linked to the smoke. Residents describe daily life as a series of compromises. Keeping children indoors, avoiding strenuous activity, and wearing masks or scarves to filter the acrid air. Yet these measures provide limited relief, as the smoke seeps into homes, classrooms, and workplaces. Even the simplest acts, such as walking to the market or sending a child to school, have become dangerous. Community outcry and demands for action. Amid this growing crisis, Dar es Salaam residents are calling on Guinea's military leader, General Mamadi Doumbouya, to act. Since seizing power in 2021, Doumbouya has championed national development projects, infrastructure improvements, and initiatives like Simandu 2040, which aims to harness revenue from Guinea's vast iron ore deposits for economic growth. Many youths have praised recent road repairs and urban upgrades in neighborhoods long neglected by previous governments. But for residents of Dar es Salaam, these promises mean little if the air they breathe is toxic. We demand that the general come to our aid and help us remove this dump from Dar es Salaam, said Nana Rachel Bangora, a representative of the Citizen Collective for a Healthy Environment. Standing amidst smoldering heaps of waste, she added, "We are tired of living in Dar es Salaam, but we have our homes here. We cannot leave. We need immediate government action before more lives are lost." Community groups have organized protests and submitted petitions to municipal authorities, emphasizing the urgent need for intervention. They argue that long-term planning, proper waste management, and relocation of the dump are essential to prevent further health disasters. Yet despite repeated appeals, local officials have offered only partial solutions, often citing budgetary constraints or logistical challenges as reasons for delays. The human toll. Residents describe a community under siege. Respiratory ailments are widespread, and stress and anxiety are mounting as families watch children struggle to breathe. Many adults have reported chronic coughing, headaches, and eye irritation, while local clinics are overwhelmed with patients seeking treatment for conditions linked to smoke exposure. For families like Silla's and Bangora's, the crisis extends beyond health. Economic opportunities are limited, as residents avoid working outdoors, markets, or any activity that exposes them to the fumes. Property values have dropped, schools are affected, and the overall quality of life has deteriorated. We live in fear every day, said Silla. "We have no choice but to stay, because this is our home, but our survival is at stake." Calls for national policy reform. Health experts stress that immediate government intervention is necessary, but long-term policy changes are equally important. Dr. Takba emphasized the need for a comprehensive national strategy to address waste management, enforce environmental regulations, and provide health support to affected communities. "This is not just a local problem," she said. Dar es Salaam is a microcosm of a larger environmental and public health crisis in Guinea. Without action, more people will suffer, and the cost to society will grow. Environmental activists are urging a multi-pronged approach. Closure or relocation of the municipal dump, strict monitoring of open burning, investment in waste recycling and management infrastructure, and public awareness campaigns about the risks of exposure to toxic smoke. They argue that a combination of enforcement, education, and investment is the only way to prevent a catastrophe from worsening. A community in limbo. As the smoke continues to rise over Dar es Salaam, the community remains trapped in a precarious balance between survival and despair. Residents like Silla and Bangora cling to hope that the government will act, yet they remain skeptical, noting that repeated promises in other areas of national development have often failed to reach their neighborhood. "We hear about projects and plans, but what about us?" Bangora asked. "Clean air is not a luxury. It is a right. Our children should not have to pay the price for neglect." In a country striving to recover from political upheaval and pursue economic development, Dar es Salaam represents both a warning and a test. The health and well-being of its residents are a stark reminder that development must include environmental justice and community protection. Until decisive measures are taken, the toxic smoke will continue to choke the community, and daily life will remain a battle for each breath. From Conakry, Aissata Diallo for Africa News. My next news is Source: Africa News. Kagame and Tshisekedi in Washington. Can Trump broker peace in DR Congo's endless war? Washington, Rwanda's Paul Kagame and the Democratic Republic of Congo's Felix Tshisekedi arrived in Washington on Thursday to endorse a U.S.-brokered peace accord alongside President Donald Trump, setting the stage for what American diplomats hope will be a historic resolution to one of Africa's most protracted conflicts. The agreement, building on a June initial framework and a November follow-up, aims to ratify commitments for troop withdrawals, militia disarmament, and economic cooperation in eastern DR Congo, a region that continues to reel from the M23 rebel advances that displaced over 100,000 people just last month. For Washington, the summit represents a final push after prior African-led initiatives, including Angola's Luanda process and Kenya's Nairobi talks, collapsed under mutual accusations. Rwanda has long been accused of backing the M23 rebels, while Kinshasa is accused of harboring genocidaire FDLR fighters. U.S. diplomats framed Thursday's gathering as a decisive moment to break the cycle of stalled negotiations and recurring violence. Economic interests in the mix. The peace effort is not just about diplomacy, it is closely tied to mineral wealth. The eastern DRC produces around 70% of the world's cobalt, essential for electric vehicle batteries and other high-tech applications. President Trump leveraged this economic angle, promising U.S. investment to de-risk the supply chains from Congo's mines to Rwanda's processing capacity. Regional leaders, including Burundi's President Evariste Ndayishimiye and Kenya's William Ruto, attended to signal support, though parallel talks in Qatar with M23 highlight the fractured and overlapping nature of regional diplomacy. While Washington hailed the accord as historic, the reality on the ground remains far less optimistic. The M23 rebels, designated by the United Nations as having links to Rwanda, control key strategic locations, including Goma Airport and several supply routes. They clash almost daily with Congolese forces and allied Wazalendo militias, demonstrating that the ground war continues unabated despite the high-profile political theater in Washington. Humanitarian crisis persists. Eastern Congo remains one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Over 7 million people are displaced across the region. Aid convoys face regular obstruction, schools and hospitals are shelled, and cholera is surging in overcrowded camps. Residents of Goma, the city at the epicenter of the conflict, expressed skepticism about the accord, citing repeated failures of prior agreements where ceasefires lasted days, not months. Leaders sign in hotels while we bury children, one Goma teacher told Reuters, summarizing the beery perspective of many locals. The frustration reflects years of disillusionment, as high-level agreements often fail to translate into security, basic services, or meaningful protection for civilians. Voices from the front line. In Bukavu, traders reported Rwandan goods flooding local markets despite international sanctions, raising questions about enforcement and compliance. In Uvira, fishermen fled drone strikes reportedly linked to Kigali, highlighting the blurred line between civilian life and military operations. Local civil society groups have demanded inclusion in the peace process. Ituri-based women's associations, in particular, are calling for land reforms that they claim are consistently ignored in elite-led summits. Activists argue that without grassroots participation, agreements risk reinforcing existing inequities, while doing little to improve day-to-day security and livelihoods. Kigali and Kinshasa continue to exchange accusations. Rwanda points to evidence of over 10,000 FDLR fighters within eastern Congo, while Kinshasa has provided satellite imagery suggesting Rwandan troop movements in conflict zones. This mutual finger-pointing underscores the deep mistrust that has hampered previous diplomatic efforts and complicates the implementation of any peace framework. The test of implementation. Despite the optimism in Washington, questions remain about whether the accord can halt the fighting, restore humanitarian access, and disarm notorious militias like the FDLR without harming civilians. Analysts stress that the agreement's success depends on more than signatures and photo opportunities. It requires a credible enforcement mechanism, ongoing monitoring by regional and international actors, and genuine engagement with the affected communities. The political agreement is only the first step, said political analyst Omar Grace. Implementation will determine whether this is historic or just another failed promise. The danger lies in transitioning from armed conflict to economic exploitation that benefits elites while leaving ordinary people in misery. The stakes are high, with UN sanctions looming and an African Union summit scheduled next month. The international community will scrutinize compliance and progress. Observers emphasize that the accord must demonstrate tangible results from Kivu to Washington, or it risks repeating the failures of previous peace initiatives in the region. Regional and international implications. The DRC-Rwanda conflict is not isolated. It has ramifications across the Great Lakes region. Stability in eastern Congo affects trade, security, and refugee flows in neighboring countries, such as Uganda, Burundi, and Tanzania. Moreover, the global demand for cobalt and other minerals adds pressure on both governments to maintain control and secure their economic interests. By positioning itself as a key broker, the United States also signals its strategic interest in the region. Trump's administration emphasizes the dual goals of advancing peace while securing critical resources for U.S. industries. Critics, however, warn that such involvement risks prioritizing resource access over long-term, locally driven solutions to the conflict. Cautious hope amid uncertainty. For millions of Congolese caught in the conflict, optimism is cautious at best. While the Washington Agreement is being hailed abroad as a major diplomatic achievement, civilians remain exposed to daily violence, displacement, and deprivation. Will M23 rebels halt their offensives by Christmas? Can aid convoys safely reach isolated communities? Will local populations see meaningful participation in political and economic recovery? These questions remain unanswered. Peace is not a piece of paper signed in a hotel conference room, a teacher in Goma remarked. It is when our children can go to school safely, when families can farm without fear, and when markets are not sites of danger. The ultimate test of the U.S. brokered peace accord will not be the photo opportunities in Washington, but whether the guns fall silent in Kivu, whether aid reaches starving families, and whether the cycle of mistrust and violence can finally be broken. For now, the people of Eastern Congo continue to live in uncertainty. Elite handshakes may dominate headlines, but the true measure of success will be felt in the villages, towns, and camps where life has been defined by conflict for decades. The question on everyone's mind remains: can Chon succeed where past African leaders have failed? Or will this agreement join a long list of historic but hollow promises? From Washington and Goma, Malika Elise for Africa News. My next news is Africa News. Goma residents skeptical as Congo-Rwanda peace deal is finalized in Washington. Goma, Democratic Republic of Congo, while political leaders in Washington celebrated what they called a historic peace agreement between the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and Rwanda on Thursday, residents of Goma, a city at the epicenter of eastern Congo's protracted conflict, expressed skepticism and fear, questioning whether the accord will translate into real change on the ground. The deal, formally endorsed by Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi and Rwandan President Paul Kagame, follows months of negotiations and builds on initial agreements signed by their foreign ministers in June and November. Officials in Washington hailed the agreement as a milestone in international diplomacy, signaling hopes for troop withdrawals, militia disarmament, and economic cooperation aimed at stabilizing eastern DR Congo. Despite the high-level political fanfare, life in Goma remains marred by insecurity and persistent violence. Jemba Atsu, a longtime resident, voiced cautious hope tempered by exhaustion. If their meeting will bring us peace, that's a good thing, he said. We have been at war for a long time and the population continues to suffer. Others are far less optimistic. Shishalo Mihimo expressed deep skepticism, reflecting a common sentiment among the city's residents who have witnessed multiple peace initiatives falter. They say they are in a peace process, and then we learn that the war starts again, she said. It hurts us and we are very worried. The anxiety stems from years of repeated cycles of violence in North and South Kivu, where armed groups have routinely exploited weak governance and limited state presence. Even as the peace deal was being finalized in Washington, clashes continued in the conflict zones of eastern Congo. Local sources reported confrontations between the Congolese army and the rebel group AFC-M23 in Kamanyola and Katagoda, South Kivu, earlier this week. These incidents culminated in a fresh surge of fighting confirmed on Thursday morning, highlighting the fragile nature of the ceasefire and the difficulties in translating diplomatic agreements into field-level stability. Political analysts caution that the symbolic importance of the Washington deal should not overshadow the challenges of implementation. Omar Grace, a Congolese political analyst, warned, politically, this agreement is historic. However, there is cause for concern regarding its implementation. The mechanism will not depend solely on the written text. There are greater dangers linked to shifting from armed conflict to unfair economic exploitation. Grace comments underscore persistent concern in the region that peace agreements may facilitate resource control and political gains for elites while doing little to alleviate the humanitarian crisis faced by ordinary citizens. The human cost of the ongoing conflict remains high. Civil society organizations in South Kivu report at least 20 civilian deaths over the past week, including women and children caught in crossfire. Humanitarian agencies highlight that thousands of families continue to be displaced, with camps for internally displaced persons overcrowded, lacking adequate food, shelter, and access to basic health care. Malnutrition and disease are rampant, further complicating the already dire humanitarian landscape. On the military front, both sides continue to accuse each other of violating the ceasefire. The Congolese army maintains that the M23 rebels, who are alleged to have links to Rwanda, reignited hostilities, while the AFC M23 counters that government forces initiated bombing campaigns against their positions. This tit-for-tat of accusations is emblematic of the deep-seated mistrust between the parties, and serves as a constant reminder of the fragile nature of previous ceasefires, many of which have collapsed within days or weeks. Residents of Goma describe daily life as dominated by uncertainty and fear. Schools and local businesses are frequently disrupted by clashes or threats from armed groups, while markets operate under the constant risk of looting or shelling. Despite international attention and diplomatic pressure, locals feel that the voices and needs of civilians are often overlooked in high-level discussions. From our perspective, signatures on a paper are meaningless if the fighting continues in our neighborhoods, said Jemba Atsu. International observers note that the Washington peace agreement, while notable for bringing top leaders together, is only one component of a much broader and complex peace process in the Great Lakes region. Previous African-led initiatives, such as Angola's Luanda process and Kenya's Nairobi talks, have similarly failed to deliver lasting security, often collapsing amid mutual accusations of support for armed groups. Analysts emphasize that for the current agreement to succeed, mechanisms for accountability, monitoring, and inclusive dialogue must be implemented, ensuring that all stakeholders, including local communities, have a role in the process. Economic considerations are also central to the deal. Eastern Congo is rich in minerals, including coltan, cobalt, and gold, resources that have historically fueled both conflict and exploitation. Observers like Omar Grace warn that peace agreements risk being co-opted by elite interests seeking to secure control over these resources, rather than serving the broader population. Effective enforcement and transparent management of resources will therefore be critical in determining whether the peace process benefits civilians or simply entrenches existing power structures. Despite these challenges, there is a glimmer of cautious optimism among some residents and civil society leaders. The Washington summit, attended by President Tshisekedi, President Kagame, and U.S. President Donald Trump, alongside other regional leaders, represents unprecedented international attention and political pressure on the parties involved. Advocates hope that continued monitoring by the United Nations, the African Union, and regional actors can help ensure compliance with the peace accord and prevent the recurrence of large-scale hostilities. For now, however, the people of Goma remain in a state of limbo. The words of residents like Shishalo Mahimo and Jemba Atsu echo across the city. They want more than diplomatic recognition. They want tangible peace, an end to the shelling and killings, and the opportunity to rebuild lives disrupted by decades of conflict. The disparity between the celebratory statements in Washington and the daily reality in Goma underscores the critical need for implementation on the ground, rather than purely symbolic diplomacy. As international diplomats celebrate progress abroad, the situation in Eastern Congo remains precarious. Residents continue to navigate a landscape shaped by armed groups, resource-driven conflicts, and the slow, often uneven, response of government and international actors. The Washington peace deal, while historic in its political symbolism, must now prove its value in the streets, homes, and markets of Goma, where the stakes for peace are measured in human lives and community stability. In conclusion, while the peace agreement represents a potential turning point in Congo-Rwanda relations, the path ahead remains fraught with obstacles. Implementation mechanisms, oversight, and genuine engagement with local populations will be essential to transform signed commitments into lasting security and prosperity for the people of Eastern DR Congo. Until then, residents of Goma are likely to continue approaching diplomatic milestones with cautious hope, wary of promises that may not translate into meaningful change. From Goma, Malaika Elise for Africa News. My next news is BBC. North Wales police officer dismissed after inappropriate conduct at colleague's party. Carnarvon, Wales. A North Wales police officer has been dismissed following a misconduct hearing into inappropriate and sexually offensive behavior at a colleague's leaving party. TC Pamela Pritchard, 29, was found to have groped two colleagues, kissed one, and engaged in sexually suggestive dancing, in a case that has drawn widespread attention due to the nature of the conduct and the officer's public role. The incident took place in March 2024 at the Carnarvon Rugby Club in Gwynedd, during a leaving party attended by several police officers, including PC Pritchard, who joined North Wales Police as a trainee in 2023. During the event, Pritchard, who had been drinking, engaged in a series of actions that violated professional standards and were classified as misconduct. According to testimony presented at a 4-day hearing held in Colwyn Bay, Conwy, PC Pritchard first grabbed a male colleague's groin twice in the presence of others and later sat on his knee, kissing him. The officer also targeted a female colleague, grabbing her breasts after performing sexually suggestive, twerking moves on the dance floor. Another senior colleague was also reportedly approached with inappropriate intentions. The male officer, identified in the hearing as Police Constable B, described his experience in stark terms. To no extent was it appropriate. I felt kind of humiliated at that point, he told the panel. He recounted that Pritchard repeated the groping later in the evening when officers went outside to the smoking area. At around 2200 hours British summertime, he said Pritchard sat on his knee, placed her hand around his neck, and kissed him on the lips. The female officer, known as Police Constable A, reported a similarly distressing experience. She told the panel, PC Pritchard came up from behind me, put both her arms around my neck, then put them under my armpits and grabbed my breasts and squeezed them. The accounts were corroborated by CCTV footage from the rugby club, showing Pritchard dancing suggestively and engaging in the physical acts described. During the hearing, PC Pritchard admitted that her behavior was inappropriate, but denied that it constituted gross misconduct. She expressed remorse and stated that she remembered little of the events due to intoxication. I feel I've let down the police. I've let down myself and I've let down my family, Pritchard said through tears. She explained that seeing the CCTV footage of herself left her mortified, and said she did not recognize the person captured in the recordings. Barrister Fiona Clancy, representing Pritchard, argued that the officer should be allowed to retain her position. Clancy stated that the misconduct was a short-lived episode, of brief duration, and there is no risk of it happening again. She emphasized Pritchard's voluntary work, commitment to fitness, and expressed motivation to continue serving the community. Despite these arguments, the panel, chaired by Assistant Chief Constable Chris Alsop, concluded that all allegations against Pritchard were proven. Overall, the panel finds that the breaches of standards are of medium to high seriousness which could justify dismissal as gross misconduct, Alsop stated. The panel cited the repeated nature of the offenses, their public setting, and the impact on colleagues as aggravating factors in their decision. North Wales Police Deputy Chief Constable Nigel Harrison emphasized that while officers are entitled to relax and enjoy themselves off duty, Pritchard's actions were simply not acceptable by anyone's standards. He said the dismissal was appropriate to maintain public confidence and ensure that officers who fail to meet professional standards cannot continue serving in law enforcement. She has rightly been dismissed, bringing to an end her very short career with us and preventing her from serving with any other UK force, Harrison said. The misconduct hearing highlighted the importance of maintaining professional conduct, even in informal settings such as social gatherings. While alcohol was a factor, the panel noted that intoxication does not excuse behavior that violates force standards or infringes on the rights and dignity of colleagues. Sexual harassment and assault in the workplace, or in professional contexts involving colleagues, remain serious offenses that carry significant consequences. PC Pritchard's case also underscores the role of technology in accountability. CCTV footage played a crucial role in corroborating the testimonies of the victims, providing clear visual evidence of the inappropriate conduct. The recordings allowed the panel to assess the seriousness of the incidents objectively and reinforce the credibility of the witnesses' accounts. In her testimony, Pritchard expressed ongoing distress over the incident, reporting panic and nightmares in the aftermath. She acknowledged that the public perception of her as a potential sexual predator was profoundly damaging, both personally and professionally. The hearing noted the impact on her mental health, but also emphasized that personal distress does not negate accountability for misconduct. Experts in police conduct and workplace behavior commented that cases like Pritchard's illustrate the complex balance between recognizing human error and maintaining strict ethical standards within law enforcement. Officers are held to high professional expectations, and breaches of trust, particularly those involving sexual harassment, can undermine public confidence in policing institutions. The dismissal of PC Pritchard sends a clear message within North Wales Police and across UK law enforcement agencies. It reinforces the principle that inappropriate sexual behavior, even outside official duty hours, will not be tolerated. Law enforcement organizations often face heightened scrutiny regarding officers' conduct due to their role in enforcing the law and protecting the public. Maintaining high standards internally is critical to preserving the integrity of the profession. The case also raises questions about officer training, awareness, and preventive measures to reduce incidents of misconduct at social events. While Pritchard's actions were unusual, the panel emphasized that education on professional boundaries, respectful conduct, and alcohol consumption could mitigate risks in similar circumstances. officers must understand that responsibility does not end at the conclusion of formal duties. Behavior in public or semi-public settings remains subject to the same ethical standards. North Wales Police stated that this dismissal would prevent Pritchard from joining any other UK police force, highlighting the long-term career consequences of proven misconduct. The force emphasized that maintaining trust with the public and among colleagues is paramount, and breaches of this trust are treated with utmost seriousness. In conclusion, PC Pamela Pritchard's dismissal from North Wales Police reflects the organization's commitment to upholding professional standards and ensuring accountability. While the officer expressed remorse and personal distress, the panel determined that her behavior at a social event constituted a significant breach of conduct, involving sexual harassment and assault. The decision underscores the importance of professional integrity, the role of accountability mechanisms such as CCTV evidence and misconduct panels, and the ongoing responsibility of law enforcement officers to maintain ethical behavior, both on and off duty. The case has drawn attention to the need for continued training, preventive measures, and robust enforcement of professional standards in policing, reinforcing that misconduct, particularly of a sexual nature, has serious personal and professional consequences. My next news is Reuters. U.S. lawmakers threaten war powers vote if Trump attacks Venezuela. Washington. A group of U.S. senators announced on Tuesday that they plan to file a resolution to compel Congress to vote on any unauthorized military strike against Venezuela by the Trump administration. The move comes amid growing concern over President Donald Trump's escalating military operations off the coast of Venezuela and allegations of potentially unlawful attacks on drug boats in international waters. Senators Tim Kaine of Virginia, Chuck Schumer of New York, Adam Schiff of California, and Republican Rand Paul of Kentucky issued a joint statement warning that any unauthorized strike would be a colossal and costly mistake that needlessly risks the lives of our service members. They emphasized that Congress, not the president, holds the constitutional authority to declare war, and that unilateral military action in Venezuela would violate this principle. Should a strike occur, we will call up a war powers resolution to force a debate and vote in Congress that would block the use of U.S. forces in hostilities against or within Venezuela, the senators said, signaling their intent to hold the administration accountable through legislative channels. The move follows weeks of mounting concern over the Trump administration's military operations in the Caribbean and Pacific, including multiple strikes on vessels allegedly involved in drug trafficking. According to lawmakers, these operations have resulted in at least 83 deaths over the past 3 months, as U.S. troops have carried out at least 21 separate strikes. The most controversial of these incidents involved the September 2nd strike, in which Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth allegedly ordered a second attack on a boat to kill survivors of an initial strike, raising questions about adherence to international law. Republican-led congressional committees have also launched investigations into the administration's handling of military operations in Venezuela, reflecting bipartisan unease about the legality and strategy behind the campaign. Last week, several Republican senators criticized the White House over its handling of a proposed Ukraine peace plan, claiming it favored Russian interests, highlighting the growing willingness of members of Trump's party to publicly challenge his foreign policy decisions. Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, a Republican on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, expressed concern about the legality of the September 2nd strike. But my understanding is that we may have a problem if you're killing survivors in the water after a strike, Rounds told reporters. Once we get the facts, then we can start making determinations that need to be made. The escalating military activity is part of a broader U.S. strategy to pressure Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who has been in power amid political turmoil, economic collapse, and widespread protests. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt defended the strikes, stating that Secretary Hegseth authorized Admiral Frank Bradley to conduct the September 2nd operations, which took place in international waters and were designed to protect U.S. interests in accordance with the law of armed conflict. Despite these assurances, Democrats and some Republicans argue that the administration has repeatedly bypassed Congress, undermining constitutional checks on presidential war powers. In October, Senate Republicans blocked a resolution that would have halted the Caribbean boat strikes. A month later, they blocked another resolution that would have prevented Trump from launching attacks on Venezuelan territory, without congressional approval. The repeated failure of Congress to assert authority has drawn criticism from both sides of the aisle. Unauthorized military action risks lives, violates the Constitution, and could spark a regional crisis, Senator Schumer said at a press briefing. Congress must assert its authority to prevent unilateral actions that put American troops and the region at risk. The proposed War Powers Resolution would force the Trump administration to justify any future military action against Venezuela directly to Congress. Such a resolution, if successful, could restrict the president's ability to deploy forces without legislative oversight and establish a clear precedent for congressional involvement in U.S. military operations abroad. Observers note that the legislation faces significant political hurdles. Trump's Republicans, who control several key committees, have consistently blocked attempts to limit presidential military authority, citing national security concerns and the need for rapid operational flexibility in combating drug trafficking and other transnational threats. Nonetheless, bipartisan support for oversight is growing as reports of potentially unlawful attacks and civilian casualties continue to emerge. Legal scholars argue that repeated strikes without congressional authorization could constitute a violation of U.S. law, specifically the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which requires the president to seek congressional approval for military action lasting more than 60 days. The resolution is intended to prevent presidents from unilaterally engaging in prolonged conflicts without legislative consent, yet its enforcement has historically been weak and contested. Meanwhile, human rights and international law experts have raised concerns about the September 2nd attack. Killing survivors in the water, if verified, could constitute a violation of international humanitarian law, including the principle of distinction, which prohibits targeting non-combatants. These allegations have further intensified calls for Congress to intervene and demand a full accounting of the military campaign's legality and execution. As Trump continues to escalate U.S. military presence in the region, lawmakers are under increasing pressure to respond. Democrats have framed the proposed resolution as both a constitutional necessity and a practical measure to prevent further loss of life. "We cannot allow the president to wage war by decree," said Senator Kaine. "Our service members deserve oversight, and the American people deserve transparency." The geopolitical implications of U.S. strikes in Venezuela are complex. Maduro has maintained a defiant stance against U.S. intervention, and any escalation could destabilize the already fragile political situation in the country. Venezuela's military and paramilitary forces, combined with regional actors, could retaliate, creating the potential for a wider conflict in Latin America. Beyond immediate military and political concerns, the situation highlights broader questions about executive power in the United States. The repeated use of strikes without congressional approval raises questions about the balance of authority between the presidency and legislature, particularly when lives are at stake and international law may be violated. Congress's response, or lack thereof, will be closely watched as a precedent for future conflicts. In addition to the War Powers Resolution, lawmakers are calling for a full investigation into Secretary Hetsetter's role in authorizing attacks, including documentation of orders, internal communications, and the chain of command. Lawmakers stress the need for transparency and accountability, warning that failure to provide full disclosure could erode public trust and damage U.S. credibility abroad. White House officials maintain that the strikes are legally justified and necessary to protect U.S. interests, including countering drug trafficking and safeguarding American personnel in the Caribbean. Nevertheless, the combination of congressional opposition, ongoing investigations, and potential international law violations has created a politically charged environment in Washington, where the administration's actions in Venezuela are under unprecedented scrutiny. As lawmakers prepare to file the War Powers Resolution, the broader debate over presidential authority, military oversight, and the legality of unilateral strikes continues to unfold. The resolution represents both a challenge to Trump's foreign policy approach and a reaffirmation of Congress's constitutional role in decisions that carry profound consequences for U.S. forces and international stability. With U.S. forces having conducted at least 21 strikes in the past 3 months, the stakes are high. The coming weeks will likely see heightened debate, hearings, and potentially a rare congressional vote on war powers that could shape the limits of presidential authority for years to come. lawmakers, legal experts, and observers agree. The situation in Venezuela is not just a regional crisis, but a test of American governance, law, and the balance of power in foreign policy. My next news is Associated Press. No kill-all order. Navy Admiral tells lawmakers amid scrutiny of Venezuela strike. Washington, U.S. Navy Admiral Fred Mitch Bradley appeared before Congress Thursday, making a firm and precise point. There was no kill-them-all order from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth regarding a controversial military operation near Venezuela that resulted in the deaths of 2 survivors of an initial strike on an alleged drug boat. Bradley, accompanied by General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed lawmakers in classified sessions on Capitol Hill as part of a growing congressional investigation into the incident, which has drawn national attention and sparked heated debate about the legality and ethics of U.S. military operations in international waters. The incident, which occurred on September 2nd, involved an initial strike on what U.S. authorities identified as a drug trafficking vessel in international waters near Venezuela. Reports indicate that 2 survivors of the first strike were subsequently killed during a second operation. Initial reporting from the Washington Post suggested that Bradley had ordered the second strike to comply with Hegseth's alleged directive to kill everybody. These reports sparked outrage among lawmakers, legal experts, and human rights advocates, raising questions about potential violations of both domestic and international law. In Thursday's briefing, Bradley was clear. No such blanket order to kill all was issued. Senator Tom Cotton, who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee, described the briefing as detailed and precise. Admiral Bradley was very clear that he was given no such order, to give no quarter or to kill them all. He was given an order that, of course, was written down in great detail, Cotton said after the briefing. He defended the operation as lawful, emphasizing that the directives provided were specific and intended to comply with U.S. military standards and rules of engagement. However, not all lawmakers left the briefing reassured. Representative Jim Himes, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, described what he saw as one of the most troubling things in his public service career. You have 2 individuals in clear distress without any means of locomotion, with a destroyed vessel who were killed by the United States, Himes said. His comments highlight the tension in Congress between those defending the military's actions and those demanding a rigorous investigation into potential wrongdoing. The stakes are high for both Bradley and Hegseth. Bradley, a career naval officer with decades of service, now finds himself at the center of a political storm. Hegseth, appointed defense secretary by President Donald Trump, faces mounting scrutiny over the legality and propriety of the strike. Trump has publicly backed Hegseth, insisting that the defense secretary acted appropriately, but pressure continues to build from congressional Democrats and some Republicans who are concerned about potential breaches of international law and the precedent such actions might set. Lawmakers are seeking a comprehensive accounting of the operation. Among the key questions are what orders Hegseth actually issued, how they were communicated to naval officers, and what legal rationale guided the second strike. There is also growing demand for the release of all video footage from the operation, as well as written orders, operational directives, and internal communications that could clarify the chain of command. Democrats argue that transparency is essential to ensure accountability, while Republicans insist that a thorough, methodical review will reveal the facts and protect the integrity of the U.S. military. Senator Roger Wicker, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, described the ongoing investigation as meticulous and data-driven. The investigation is going to be done by the numbers, he said. We'll find out the ground truth. Wicker's comments signal a commitment from Congress to understand precisely what occurred and to ensure that military actions are consistent with U.S. law, international norms, and ethical standards. The controversy also touches on broader concerns about the rules of engagement for U.S. forces operating overseas. International law clearly prohibits targeting individuals who are hors de combat, that is, no longer actively participating in hostilities. Legal experts have warned that if the second strike was intended to kill survivors who were incapacitated or otherwise unable to defend themselves, it could constitute a serious violation of international humanitarian law. This makes the investigation not only a matter of domestic oversight, but also a potential point of international scrutiny. raising questions about U.S. adherence to global norms governing armed conflict. Despite these concerns, the Trump administration continues to defend the operation. White House officials have argued that the strike was necessary to prevent the illicit transport of drugs and to ensure the safety of U.S. forces and international shipping lanes. They emphasized that the orders provided to Bradley were precise and consistent with the goal of neutralizing a potential threat without unnecessary loss of life. Yet, the existence of video footage showing the second strike has intensified the debate, as lawmakers and the public wrestle with the visual reality of U.S. military action, leading to the deaths of individuals in distress. The Navy and the Joint Chiefs of Staff have pledged full cooperation with congressional investigators. Bradley and Kane's presence on Capitol Hill reflects the seriousness with which the military views the investigation and the commitment to providing lawmakers with all available information. However, the fact that most lawmakers declined to comment after the briefings underscores the sensitivity of the matter and the classified nature of the details discussed. It also illustrates the political tightrope the military must navigate, balancing operational security with accountability and public transparency. Pressure is mounting on Hegseth as the investigation proceeds. While Trump remains publicly supportive, the growing scrutiny from Congress, legal experts, and media outlets suggests that the defense secretary's decisions will remain under a microscope. The situation underscores the challenges faced by U.S. military leadership when operating in complex, high-stakes environments far from American shores. It also highlights the need for clear, lawful, and well-documented orders to prevent misunderstandings or allegations of misconduct. As the investigation continues, several key questions remain unanswered. What was the precise intent behind the second strike? Were U.S. legal and ethical standards followed in targeting the survivors? How will Congress assess accountability, and what potential consequences might there be for those involved? These questions will shape the ongoing debate about the appropriate use of military force in international waters and the responsibilities of civilian and military leadership in authorizing potentially lethal actions. Ultimately, the case illustrates the tension between operational necessity, legal constraints, and public accountability. While the Navy asserts that no kill-all order was issued, the deaths of the two survivors have already sparked controversy and raised serious ethical questions. As lawmakers, legal experts, and the public continue to examine the facts, the incident serves as a reminder of the immense responsibility placed on those making life-and-death decisions in the field, and the enduring need for transparency, oversight, and adherence to the rule of law. The congressional investigation is ongoing, with further briefings and potential hearings expected in the coming weeks. The results of this investigation will not only determine the accountability of those directly involved, but could also influence future policies regarding U.S. military operations, rules of engagement, and the broader conduct of American forces operating abroad. In the meantime, Bradley, Kane, Hegseth, and the White House remain under careful scrutiny as the nation seeks to reconcile operational imperatives with legal and moral obligations. My next news is African news. Somalis criticized Trump's remarks, called them racist. Many Somalis on Wednesday criticized U.S. President Donald Trump's remarks, calling Somalis garbage, describing the comments as racist and offensive. Several residents expressed disappointment and concern, with some reconsidering travel plans to the United States. Ibrahim Hassan Haji, a Somali citizen, said he would no longer travel to the U.S. following the remarks. "I never thought a president, especially in his second term, would speak so harshly," he told the Associated Press. "Because of this, I have no plans to travel to the U.S. Abdurrahman Moral and other Somalis in the capital, Mogadishu, expressed frustration with their government's muted response to the remarks, viewing it as a sign of weakness. "It pains me to see that even when confronted, they fail to respond meaningfully," Moral said. In recent weeks, President Trump has increasingly focused on Somalis living in the United States, claiming that they have caused a lot of trouble. On Tuesday, he stated that he did not want Somalis in the country because they contribute nothing. The president's statements came shortly after a person familiar with federal planning said that authorities are preparing a targeted immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota. The operation would primarily focus on Somali immigrants living unlawfully in the United States. My next news is African news. Venezuela. U.S. deportation flights continue despite airspace closure threat. News report. Flights operated by the United States government carrying deported Venezuelan migrants will continue as scheduled, despite President Donald Trump's recent declaration that Venezuela's airspace should be considered closed to American aircraft. The administration of President Nicolas Maduro confirmed on Tuesday that the twice-weekly deportation flights will proceed. The announcement came after a formal request from the Trump administration, reversing an earlier statement issued by Venezuelan authorities on Saturday, which had suggested that United States immigration officials had unilaterally suspended the flights. According to Venezuela's Foreign Affairs Minister, an overflight and landing application submitted on Monday by United States-based Eastern Airlines was made public on Tuesday. The request seeks authorization for an arrival on Wednesday, indicating that operations are continuing regardless of Trump's airspace warning. Throughout this year, Venezuela has been receiving steady numbers of deported nationals as part of an agreement reached under growing pressure from the Trump administration. The arrangement ended President Maduro's long-standing policy of refusing to take back Venezuelan citizens deported from the United States. The deportation flights typically land at the main airport outside the capital, Caracas. They are operated either by a United States government contractor or by Venezuela's state-owned airline. According to official figures, more than 13,000 Venezuelan migrants have been returned so far this year on these chartered flights. Venezuela continues to experience significant outward migration driven by economic hardship, political instability, and insecurity. The ongoing deportations add another layer of complexity to the already strained relationship between Washington and Caracas. My next news is Africa news. Africa has once again found itself at the center of international judgment. Not because it failed to act, not because it cannot speak, but because powerful nations have decided they will speak for Africa. And on this day, the United States government, represented by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, stood before the world to declare a new policy. Visa restrictions aimed at Nigerians allegedly involved in violence against Christians. The announcement was bold. It was loud. It was crafted to sound morally unquestionable. Yet, when you peel back the layers, when you examine not just the message but the motive, another truth emerges. A truth every African must confront. The United States claims it is responding to what it calls mass killings and anti-Christian violence in Nigeria. And at first glance, who can argue against saving lives? Who can question the value of protecting innocent Christians? But if we limit ourselves to the surface, we risk falling into the trap that has haunted Africa for generations. Letting others define our conflicts, our complexity, and our humanity through narratives that serve their interests, not ours. Marco Rubio's announcement did not stop at penalizing individuals directly involved in violence. No, it extended the punishment to families, sons, daughters, spouses, anyone connected by blood. That alone reveals something far deeper than concern for religious freedom. It reveals a political message disguised as moral action. We, the United States, will determine guilt in Africa. We, the United States, will decide who is worthy of travel, freedom, and legitimacy. And this, my brother, my sister, is a dangerous precedent. Rubio did not simply point to perpetrators. He pointed to entire groups, radical Islamic terrorists, Fulani ethnic militias, and other violent actors, labels that flatten centuries of ethnic, historical, cultural, and economic nuance into a simplistic good versus evil narrative. Labels that make Africa look like a battlefield of savages rather than a complex continent shaped by history, colonial legacies, resource competition, state failures, and global interference. This policy, he added, would apply not only to Nigerians but also to governments and individuals around the world who violate religious freedom. In other words, the United States is now positioning itself as the global police officer of religious rights. Where was this energy when Christians were massacred in the Middle East? Where was this stance when Muslim minorities in other nations begged for help? Where was this decisive action when entire regions were destabilized not by militias, but by foreign bombs? Africa must ask these questions because the world rarely answers them honestly. This announcement comes only weeks after President Donald Trump threatened military action in Nigeria, claiming Christians were being persecuted by extremist Islamist groups. He even went as far as labeling Nigeria a country of particular concern. Strong words, heavy accusations, but once again, disconnected from the complex reality on the ground. Because while it is true that Christians in Nigeria have suffered horrific violence, it is equally true, as human rights experts insist, that more Muslims than Christians have been killed by Boko Haram. This is not a Christian versus Muslim war. It is not a holy crusade. It is a multidimensional conflict involving poverty, land disputes, climate change, criminal opportunists, collapsing state structures, and extremist ideology. Nigeria itself has repeatedly rejected Donald Trump's claims. Abuja insists that these attacks are driven not by religious hatred, but by resource competition, criminal motives, and historical land tensions. And in many cases, that is true. When pastoralist Fulani herders clash with farmers, it is not because one group worships in a mosque and the other in a church. It is because climate pressure has reduced available grazing land. It is because population growth over 200 million souls has strained the soil. It is because government institutions have failed to mediate disputes effectively. But the global narrative prefers simplicity. Muslims killing Christians. Why? Because simplicity sells. It moves the political machine. It stirs emotions. It justifies foreign intervention. Nigeria is a nation of more than 200 ethnic groups, divided almost evenly between Christians and Muslims. Insecurity has plagued it from several directions. Boko Haram insurgents in the northeast, bandits attacking farming communities in the northwest, kidnappers in the central states, and clashes between pastoralists and agricultural villages across broad regions. The violence is not one color, not one religion, not one tribe. It is a fire with many sources. Yet the United States chose to isolate one narrative, the Christian one, and elevate it as justification for punitive measures. Understand this. No African rejects the protection of innocent Christians. No African rejects the condemnation of extremist violence. What Africans reject is selective outrage, geopolitical manipulation, and external powers using African tragedies as chess pieces. The question is not whether violence exists. It does. The question is not whether the victims deserve justice. They do. The question is, why is the United States framing this conflict in religious terms when the facts contradict that simplicity? Because narrative is power, and power is influence, and influence is control. Now let us examine the timing. Why now? Why this policy? Why this aggressive language? The United States is quietly positioning itself as the global guardian of religious liberty, but its credibility in Africa has declined. Many African nations are strengthening ties with China, the Middle East, and independent blocs that undermine Washington's influence. So what does the United States do? It reasserts moral authority. It identifies a crisis, takes a stance. It paints itself as the defender of the oppressed, specifically Christian populations, which resonates strongly with American evangelical political bases. This is not simply foreign policy. It is domestic politics disguised as international justice. President Donald Trump's threat of military action in Nigeria was not the outburst of a concerned humanitarian. It was messaging to American voters, messaging to conservative alliances, messaging to global observers who still believe in Washington's role as a world referee. But Africa is changing. Gone are the days when foreign nations could declare judgment on African governments and expect silence. Gone are the days when the West could point at a conflict and define it according to their own framework. Africa is learning. Africa is watching. Africa is responding. The truth is this. If the United States wants to help Nigeria, it must begin by understanding Nigeria. Not by imposing blanket condemnations. Not by threatening military action. Not by crafting narratives that deepen divisions rather than healing them. Nigeria needs investment in institutions. It needs development in rural areas. It needs technology for security monitoring. It needs strategies to combat extremist recruitment. It needs dialogue frameworks for farmers and herders. It needs support, not punishment. But what Africa does not need is another superpower declaring moral superiority over a continent it barely understands. Let it be clearly stated. Violence against Christians must be condemned. Violence against Muslims must be condemned. Violence against any Nigerian, regardless of tribe, religion, or region, must be condemned. But the solution cannot be foreign grandstanding. Africa's insecurity cannot be solved by visa restrictions. Africa's religious tensions cannot be healed by political theater. Africa's identity cannot be defined by outsiders. This report, based on Africa News, reveals a moment where global power politics once again intersects with African struggles. And as always, Africans must resist being reduced to footnotes in narratives crafted elsewhere. Let Africa speak for Africa. Let Nigeria define Nigeria. Let justice be sought for partnership, not punishment. My next news is, in the next video, I am Remi Jurmain Djalis with my news of today, Black African Diaspora news from Europe, the Netherlands.